Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, guys. So a couple of people requested that I make a video after I did a general review of the debate between Daniel Haqiqatjou and a guy called the Apostate Prophet, Ridwan. So basically, I wanted to do this in a part-by-part series in terms of my blog, posting each part, but in this video I'm gonna, since I've already written it all up, basically I just need to edit it. I'm gonna do like a full review, and then on my blog you guys will get a part-by-part breakdown, which is not going to be more comprehensive than what I'm putting out here. It's just blog posts can't be that long. Like my original write-up was like 3,000 words or something. So yeah, so first I want to give a general review of the debate. The discussion was basically the morality of the Sharia versus liberalism. And on the whole, I think Daniel did a really good job in defending the Sharia, giving rational reasons that even a non-Muslim could accept for the wisdom of the Sharia, right? One point of criticism that I want to get out of the way is that I felt that at certain points in the debate when things got kind of heated, and let's say Ridwan showed a lack of adab, Daniel allowed that to get the better of him, and he kind of reciprocated in kind rather than being the calm, rational voice in the room. He kind of had emotional retorts, or, like when Ridwan was doing that whole it's either this or that, give me a yes or no answer. Like 10 or 15 minutes later, Daniel did the same thing to him, right? Like in the time he did it, which was appropriate to show him why that's not an appropriate way of questioning. But then he did it again like 10, 15 minutes later. It's like, dude, get over it. Like, you guys moved past that point of the debate. You don't need to keep this kind of emotional tit for tat. Stick to the point. If you stick to the point, you're the side that's going to be winning because you have the stronger argument. So you don't need to allow him to rile you like that. And I felt that Daniel did allow himself to get a little bit riled at certain points in the debate, but it wasn't atrocious. So nobody's perfect, but it's just something that needs to be pointed out, and inshallah Daniel can do a better job of that next time. Other than that, I thought Daniel started off the debate on the right foot, which was to point out that liberalism is a coercive universalist system of values, right? Now, Islam is as well, right? But the entire critique of liberalism, for at least most liberals who are unaware of their philosophical presuppositions, they're just born in a liberal society. They don't even realize that they're fish swimming in this particular pond. For them, I think it's very important to get them to acknowledge this fact about liberalism, that it is a coercive system of values. Because once you get them to accept that, they've pretty much already lost the debate. The reason is twofold. First of all, once they realize that Islam is a coercive system of universal values and liberalism is a coercive system of universal values, they have to then, but they believe in liberalism, they have to then justify their value system on first principles, like from first principles, which they can't do. Okay, I'm telling you flat out right now, they can't do it. Okay, now, so that's one, is that they lose any evidence for their point of view. Now, the second reason why, once you get a person to accept that liberalism is a coercive system of values, that this is like you've already won the argument, is because the exact claim to supremacy that comes from liberalism is the fact that it allows freedom for all. That's the claim, right? We liberals, we allow freedom, whereas you, theocracies, you are a coercive system of values. But if they themselves are a coercive system of values, then their position reduces to incoherence. And that's because, they're a coercive system of values which enforces freedom. But to impose freedom becomes a contradiction, you see? Because if it's imposed, it's not freedom. So you can't impose freedom. That becomes a contradiction. And so liberalism reduces to a kind of logical incoherence, you see? Now, some people might try to escape this dichotomy by saying, you know what, we don't believe in in any coercive system, right? But I think Daniel addressed this point, which is to say that either here or maybe in a different article, which is to say that anybody who believes in good and evil, right, is going to believe in some form of enforcing that good or evil. For instance, would you let a rapist just go on the street and like rape people? Obviously not. You have to use force, right? And so that's the case both nationally and internationally. There have to be some norms, otherwise things are going to devolve into chaos. And so it's not feasible to try to get out of this by saying, oh, I don't believe in any form of coercion, which Ridwan did try to do. He's like, oh, I don't believe in any form of coercion other than sanctions, which are not really coercion, right? That was his attempt to play the hippie card. But that doesn't work, okay? And the reason why that doesn't work is because, as Daniel correctly pointed out, in the case of Iraq, you had 500,000 kids who starved to death because of sanctions. So, I mean, internationally, under international law, sanctions are recognized as an act of war. So everyone acknowledges it's an act of war and extremely brutal. Now, what I would want to do here to add to Daniel's argument is, because some of the discussion centered around the fact that liberalism was more brutal in its imposition because of the means of modern warfare versus pre-modern warfare. And when it comes to sanctions, I wanted to give a kind of pre-modern analogy here. In pre-modern warfare, you had two kinds of battles that took place. One, which was head-to-head on a battlefield, so you had Army 1 and Army 2, and they would clash. The other was a prolonged siege. So one army would be in a castle or a keep or whatever, some kind of fortification. And the other army, what they would do is they would surround the castle and prevent any food from coming in and out of the castle, okay? So what they were doing there, and this would be prolonged for months, and they would attempt to essentially starve the people inside such that they would eventually just surrender because they've run out of food. And at times, this would become so brutal that people inside the fortification would result to cannibalism. They would actually eat their dead. And if you actually read some medieval accounts of like what sieges were like, and they were actually considered a far worse form of warfare than like head-to-head combat for this reason, because it was prolonged. People would have to watch their children die as opposed to just grown men. And it was a prolonged conflict that was agonizing and torture, basically. So sanctions are a little bit like that. They're like a siege. So you don't really get away from the violence aspect of it by just saying, oh, well, Ridwan tried to frame it in like these terms that, oh, it's just like, you don't agree with my values, so I'm just going to, refuse to trade with you. It's very innocent, right? But that's not what sanctions are. You see, when the U.S. Has sanctions, it doesn't merely refuse to engage in trade with a particular country that violates their interest or allegedly violates their values, which is usually a cover really for their interests. But rather, what the U.S. does is that it bullies every other country into joining the sanctions with them. So what that means is this, that let's say you're a third party. You don't really care. Like, okay, let's say you're like South Korea. You don't really care if homosexuals are being hanged in like, Pakistan or Iran or Saudi Arabia or whatever Muslim country. You don't care, right? But the U.S. tells you, unless you join in their sanctions, they're going to sanction you. And so it's like a mafia type deal where it's like, if you're not with us, you're against us. And so South Korea doesn't want to get sanctioned. So what are they going to do? They're also going to sanction whatever country is on the hit list, basically. So what this ends up doing is that it creates that siege situation, especially in now a global village where most countries can't even grow their own food or basic necessities. They're reliant on trade to get all of that. So when you threaten to sanction them, it's really an act of violence, and it's recognized as such under international law. And it's not as innocent as what Ridwan was making out to be. If just the U.S. refused to, interact with a country, okay, that's their prerogative, but that's not what they do. They get everyone else to join in to create a very pressurized situation. you know, the other thing is that the West does resort to military intervention, both directly and indirectly. Now, when, for example, the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran, what the Western European powers did was they provided weapons, intelligence, funds, chemical warfare capacities, media coverage, everything that Saddam Hussein would need in order to invade Iran, which he did. So this was an indirect kind of proxy war that the US waged. And so just because they didn't have their boots on the ground, it doesn't mean that this wasn't a war that they were waging, you see? And this was, I felt, ignored in the debate, that Ridwan made it seem like, okay, you know, sure, liberalism has a bloody past, but now, you know, it's not that bad. We barely have any invasions, whatever. But if you count the proxy wars, what you see is that basically the US, not just the US, but in general, liberal countries do engage in acts of violence. We saw this throughout the Arab Spring. We saw this with, you know, Sisi's brutal suppression of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. We saw, you know, the supporting of Saudi Arabia in the war against Yemen and the starving Yemeni children. We're seeing, you know, supporting various factions in Syria, both directly and indirectly. So the idea that, you know, liberalism is not being spread by the sword even today is not true if you count proxy wars. But even if you take out proxy wars and you count just boots on the ground, even then I felt it was underplayed by Ridwan. You know, you have a very hard-handed approach taken in the first Gulf War. Like, we have to think about it. Korea, Vietnam, the first Gulf War, this, you know, the Israeli occupation of Palestine, you know, not to mention the trillions of dollars spent in Iraq and Afghanistan in our lifetimes. So right now, the U.S. is on the brink of bankruptcy, and they don't have popular support for another war. They don't have the money. There's a bunch of problems. But I have a question for you. Suppose the U.S. did have all the money and the capability and the logistical capabilities, whatever it is. Don't you think they would invade more countries? Like, what would stop them from invading more countries? In fact, their original plan was to take out not just Iraq and Afghanistan, but Sudan. I think they listed Sudan, Libya, Syria. They had like 6 or 7 countries that they wanted to invade in a sweep, but they found that they got bogged down in Afghanistan and Iraq. So this, you know, the fact that liberalism is not being spread as strongly by the sword, let's say if we granted that argument, is only because of logistical problems, not because of, you know, suddenly growing a heart. Okay, that would be the argument that I would make to Ridwan. And I'd also say that the level of force that is being imposed now is while liberalism is the global ruling ideology. Okay, to even get to this stage where liberalism has become the global ruling ideology, you have 400 years of a long trail of blood. Okay, so if you think about it like this, like internal to the Ottoman Empire, you had relative peace, right? Obviously, because you have one ruling power, and so obviously whenever you have one ruling power, you're going to have relative stability and relative peace. It's the same thing with China, for instance. Once you have a strong ruling power, you have relative peace in that within the borders. So the entire world right now is basically ruled by liberalism, and so Ridwan is like, okay, well, now we don't have that much war. But it's like, yeah, well, you know what? If Islam also ruled the entire globe, you wouldn't have that much war, because you'd have one ruling ideology, you see, which would bring everyone together. And it's like that within every empire. Internal to it, you don't have that much strife, except for periods of, you know, dissension and civil war. These things happen. And I'm saying you generally have relatively long periods of peace and stability. That's a natural offshoot of having one strong centralized kind of government or ruling ideology or whatever. Now, Ridwan seemed to think that liberalism was more merciful than Islam because Muslim countries get to keep vestiges of Islam. Okay, so okay, you can't execute the homosexuals, otherwise we're gonna sanction you. But you know what? If you want to have your Islamic divorce laws, aren't we not merciful? We allow this. Are we not merciful? And what I would say is that, look, even in Islamic rule, dhimmis, for instance, had their autonomy. as long as they paid homage to the political superiority of Islam. In fact, they had much more autonomy than Muslims have now under liberalism, right? They got to have their laws and their type of worship, whatever it is. You know what I mean? So what exactly is the difference here, right? What he's saying is basically that liberalism is superior to Islam because Muslims are like dhimmis under liberalism. You get what I'm trying to say? Like it's the same thing. It doesn't really follow, in my opinion. You know, the other thing is this, that one thing that I feel like Daniel could have addressed more was the fact that Ridwan kind of was not talking factually in terms of, no, I shouldn't say he wasn't talking factually. Like, one thing that was ignored by both sides was the fact that when we talk about the brutal spread of liberalism versus the spread of Islam, it's objectively the case that Islam was far less brutally spread. This is an important point to acknowledge, and I don't think it's just because of modern versus pre-modern warfare, as Daniel says, because one of the things that Daniel could have used was the excellent research that's been done by Richard Boulier, as well as some actual articles on Yaqeen. See, Daniel, Yaqeen does not have all bad articles. They do have useful research as well, and lecture that was done by Jonathan Brown. Maybe I'll link some of those stuff in the description. But basically, what they showed through quantitative statistical analyses was that it took Persia, for instance, like 300 years to become even 50% Muslim. Over 300 years. Okay? With the Christian population of the Levant, right, of Sham, was in the 13th century was still 50%. Okay? So that means that Islam was not, you know, at the point of a sword forcing people to convert. What was happening was that Islamic society gave incentives for people to convert. These were mostly in the form of social or monetary benefits that people would accrue from converting. And over time, along with the message of Islam, the powerful message of Islam, the great preachers that Islam had, as well as the taqwa and the spirituality that Muslims exude to non-Muslims, their good behavior with them, etc., inspired, and I'm not saying across the globe, I'm just saying this was a frequent enough phenomenon that altogether this created a steady stream of converts over time. Okay, but it took centuries. You compare that with liberalism, which within 300 years basically became the dominant global ideology, leaving millions of bodies in its wake. Okay, so you really do have that convert at the sword situation going on for liberalism, whereas with Islam, that doesn't appear to be the case. It was a very long, drawn-out process, a gradual process that occurred. Now, the next point I want to address here, and I'm going in the order of the debate, okay? So the next thing that major issue that I wanted to touch on, right? I'm not going to touch on everything, just the major themes, was hypersexuality amongst Muslim males, okay? So Daniel's main argument was basically this. Look, the main factor, according to the best psychological research that we have, is that family leads to happiness. Stable families lead to happiness. Islam is more conducive to, family happiness than liberalism. Therefore, Islam is a superior system. That was the basic argument. Then Ridwan brought up this issue that, okay, well, when Muslim males come to non-Muslim countries, they are hypersexual, okay? Now, here's the issue with this. First of all, it's a non sequitur. Okay, let's say that's the case, that when Muslim males leave an Islamic society, they come to a Western society, okay, and we don't even really have truly Islamic societies. We have Islamic societies that are mixed in with very heavy doses of liberalism. But okay, sure. This guy leaves his society and goes to another society. He's having trouble controlling himself. He's, viewing women all sexually, whatever. What does that do to defeat Daniel's argument, which is that Islam as a system is more conducive to family values? It just doesn't follow. And so Ridwan brought up this point, which literally has nothing to do with anything. Even if true, it doesn't address the point, okay? Now, Daniel said that he you know, he questions the factual basis of what Ridwan is saying. And if by that he means that, you know, when Ridwan was trotting out the old like gang rape narrative, that is definitely an exaggeration and not factually based, you know, then I would agree with Daniel. But in general, I do think that Ridwan does have a point, and he actually has first-hand experience with this because he himself is an immigrant. He knew the immigrants, and it's something that seems, you know, prima facie, it seems correct that there is a problem there when Muslim men do immigrate to non-Muslim societies. There is a serious problem, which we do have to acknowledge. I don't think it borders on the kind of abuse narrative that far-right people push, but I'm saying from a spiritual perspective as a Muslim, like, I don't want my brothers going out there and doing zina, right? And so that does happen. We know it does happen, that the brothers are thirsty. So, you know, but the thing is that Ridwan's analysis of this, I felt, was incorrect. You see, the reason why immigrant Muslim males are hypersexual in these destructive ways is precisely because the capitalist liberal system is set up such that people delay their marriage until they're well into their 20s. And so they're having certain human needs which are not being met. When you come from a society which is sexually repressed, or more sexually restricted, let's say, and then you put them in this environment where it's just a free-for-all, okay, and they have these desires which are not being met in any other way, yeah, you have an explosion, right? But that doesn't mean that the society in which the men's sexual desires were more restricted is in any way less conducive to family values, which is the point that Daniel was making. And in fact, you have to look at Islam as a two-part system or a multi-part system in this respect. Islam doesn't just say suppress your sexual desires and that's it. What it says is channel your sexual desires towards marriage. So you have suppression on one hand, and then you have marriage on the other. And if you take out one side of this equation, then you're going to have disaster. If you have marriage without the suppression of sexual desires, you're going to have disaster, because then people are going to commit adultery. If you have a suppression of sexual desire without marriage, you're going to have a problem, because that sexual desire needs to be channeled somewhere, and you're going to get the kind of explosions that you see happening with these immigrants in Europe. Furthermore, in liberal society, people don't have those restraints that are placed in Islamic society. So, you know, it follows naturally that this kind of, you know, freedom or this kind of explosion with so-called freedom would occur. Although I don't know if I'm just repeating myself there. Now, he contrasts this with his civilized European counterparts who can just be friends with women without thinking of them so sexually. Again, what does this have to do with anything? So what? It doesn't show that this is more conducive to family, which is necessary for happiness. Okay, that's the argument. Secondly, European men also have extremely sexual thoughts about women. But the difference is, not only are they socialized, as Daniel pointed out, to be this way, to not be as you know, let's say, pursuant of their desires. They're also raised in an environment in which, you know, essentially androgynous work drones are produced, whereas in traditional societies, men are produced and women are produced, if that makes sense. So the immigrant guys, you know, basically are acting on their natural desires. The European guys are suppressing their natural desires, if that makes sense. So it's not that they think less sexually of women, it's that they lack the courage usually to act on their desires, if that makes sense. Whereas the immigrant men, they don't care. Like, they'll approach the girl, they'll get rejected, they'll laugh it off, they don't care. They're much more masculine in a certain sense, versus the European guys, they're scared of rejection. That's a fact. That's a reality, and that accounts, I think, in large degree why you see this disparity as well. Okay. Okay, so generally, okay, to stay on point, the fact of the matter is that when you look at the stats of divorce rates in secular liberal societies, you look at the family structure, you look at the internal dynamics, it's just not as conducive to a stable family as Islam. I don't think anyone seriously disputes that, so we can move off the red herrings that Ridwan was trying to drag all over. It doesn't matter. That the point that Daniel was making is true, and so the conclusion logically follows. When it comes to polygyny, okay, Daniel presented the argument that Islam is the natural religion for man because, by man I mean human beings, because men have a natural tendency towards polygamy and women have a natural tendency for hypergamy, and so the institution of polygyny allows for this dynamic to take place. Now, Ridwan countered that, look, if we have like 10 men and 10 women, then polygamy would leave some men without mates, and that would create social instability and, or at the very least, unhappiness for those men who get left out. So, you know, how can you say that Islam is more conducive to happiness? And Daniel pointed out that there are benefits to competition, which include increased productivity. What I would add to Daniel's point is this, that throughout most of human history, because men would go to war, and the losing side, so first of all, men would go to war, so men would die on both sides. And then on the losing side, many of the women were taken as captives, right, back to the winning society. So what you have in the winning society is, because of these two factors, women coming in and men going out, basically dying, you would have a surplus of women versus men. Okay, you'd have a surplus. So because of this, generally it wasn't a problem that there are some men who just can't find a spouse, or at the very least it was more minimal because you had a surplus of women. So that's one point to bring out historically. But you might say, okay, well, in the modern period, this isn't the case. The surplus of women is very minimal. So how do you deal with that? Look, Islam also has a solution to this. The Quran directly commands believers to marry those who are single from among us. وَأَنْكِحُوا الْأَيَامَ مِنْكُمْ, right? وَالصَّالِحِينَ مِنْ عِبَادِكُمْ, I believe the ayah goes. So it follows that if there were really a large number of men who simply couldn't find wives because these polygamous men were taking all the wives, right? There is an ethical injunction here. It's not a legal injunction, but remember, when Daniel's talking about the bottom-up system versus the top-down, you can't think just legalistically. You have to think also in terms of the morals that Islam is inculcating. One of those morals is this. Let's say I already have a wife. Let's say I have 2 wives, okay? I'm a rich guy. I can get a 3rd wife, but I see my needy brother in faith, whoever it is, maybe it's my son, maybe it's whatever, maybe it's my relative, maybe it's not, maybe it's a stranger. I see this guy is in need, right? Do I take a 3rd wife, or do I help him get married to have at least 1 wife? The Islamic ethical injunction says, look, it's your legal right if you want to take a 3rd, but you're going to get a lot of rewards in the hereafter. You're going to get closer to Allah. You're going to be exemplifying, the moral virtues that are exemplary of a Muslim. You'll get spiritual rewards for marrying the single guy. Okay, so this is how Islam would deal with it. It would say, yeah, look, if it's seriously causing a problem, then marry the single guys off. There's no issue with it. So now slavery. Okay, when it comes to slavery, Daniel did a great job in giving an unapologetic answer to the question of slavery. One thing that he could have done better was to draw attention to what I call the outsourcing of the slave class. Okay? Now, when Ridwan is looking at Western countries, he's looking at them as if they're economically isolated units and then comparing that to Islam. But this is an unfair comparison because Western countries have relied on colonialism for the past 400 years. Now, when the European empires fell, what happens is these colonies gained ostensibly gained independence. India is quote unquote no longer a commonwealth of Britain, but an economic dependence between the colonizer and the colonized remained and remains to this day. Furthermore, due to globalization, every nation state's economic system is intertwined with everyone else's. Okay, there is no economically isolated economic system. Okay, so you have to look at the globe in terms of a global village, right? I'm sure you guys have heard this term before, a global village. So what you have to do is not look at who the lowest class is in France or Britain. You have to look at who the lowest class is in the global village, because that's the slave class of modern capitalist society. That's the slave class. So the guy flipping burgers at McDonald's, he's not even the slave class. That's what Ridwan was trying to, or even Daniel was comparing. He's like, look, you have slaves in Islam, you have the guy flipping burgers in McDonald's today. It's, you know, both of them are having to work hard, they have low social standing, etc. It sucks for both, right? So what's the difference? What I'm saying is no, that's not the correct comparison, although that argument can also be made. What I'm saying is that the correct comparison is between the slave in Islam versus the sweatshop worker in Vietnam. That is the correct comparison, because the sweatshop worker in Vietnam, he is the lowest class in the global village, right? And because this is an economically interdependent society, just because you've outsourced the slave class, it doesn't mean you're now a superior society, because you're still using that slave class. They just happen not to be in your national borders and don't enjoy any of your rights and freedoms. Okay? You know, so you have to look at liberalism, capitalism, as one global system of unified values. Okay? Like an empire, one empire, okay? And that is the case because, you know, you have a unity in values, in social and political institutions and structures. You have economic interdependence, and the Rothschild banks owning virtually all the currencies, okay? So it is one empire that the US kind of heads. And in this empire, you have to look at, you know, the social strata across the board. So when you look at Islam, it's true Islam did also have trade with outside countries, but it was also still in a certain sense, because of the nature of pre-modern society, an independent, let's say, you know, universe in a certain sense. It's its own entity. And so within it, you have the lowest strata and the highest strata, right? And then you have people outside. Whereas in liberalism, there's no longer anyone outside. It's just like, imagine one empire and everything is within that empire. So you have to look at it like that. And when you do that, you see that the lowest classes in global liberalism are in a much worse position than slaves were in Islam. Now, you might retort here, and that's not to undermine the fact that even the lowest classes within, let's say, the US or you know, Britain or wherever it is, they also have a hard time. I'm not denying that they're struggling to pay rent. I mean, this is everybody's hustling out there, and it's a rat race, right? What I'm trying to say, though, is that that would be more like, you know, a middle class position in the global hierarchy, if that makes sense. And so within Islam, that would be like an artisan, not even like the true slave class. Okay, so this is an important point that I feel was needs to be made here. Okay, somebody might say, you know what, you're right, but I oppose both the slavery of Islam and the sweatshop working of the Vietnamese or you know, whatever country, their, you know, sweatshop working. I oppose both of them, okay? One thing I would like to point out is that capitalism has never existed without this kind of slave class. What happened was, when capitalism was first institutionalized, right? In Britain, you had basically sweatshop workers. When people no longer put up with that, it was exported to the colonies. But the sweatshop still existed. When the colonies gained independence, you just basically have a shifting of the shell. You know, like the shell game where you put like the bead or whatever in like a spot, and then you have a bunch of shells and you shift them around. That's basically what's happening. So until they can show that this kind of liberal, free, quote unquote, free liberal capitalist society can exist without this kind of sweatshop abuse taking place, why are we to take the theoretical claim seriously? Like, okay, theoretically in an ideal world, we wouldn't have a lowest class that's treated horribly. Okay, demonstrate to us, show us where this has been done. If you can't do it, then understand that maybe your ideal doesn't exist in reality, it doesn't conform to reality, or your solutions will lead to even more disasters. So for instance, the communists had a solution to the problem of the slave class. Their solution ended up being worse than the problem. So what I'd say to people who say, look, we don't believe in Islamic slavery or sweatshop slavery, okay, what is your solution? And then until you've shown a single society in which that has been successfully implemented, I think we're justified in saying, look, the best it's going to get is the way that Islam recommends, right? Which is to treat the slaves well, to treat them like your own children, to clothe them with what you clothe, to speak to them kindly, to free them if they, request manumission and create a contract with them. All of these institutions that Islam has in place to deal with the problem of slavery, that's the best it's going to get, okay? If not, show us a better way, and then maybe we can take you, at least we can take the claim seriously. Until then, the claim has not even reached the point of being demonstrable. Okay, being a demonstrable point that we have to take seriously. It's just in the theory ideal. And this brings me to another point, which in the debate, Daniel correctly pointed out that comparing a society where everyone has the lifestyle that current billionaires enjoy would seem better to us than a society in which you have hierarchy and some people are winners and some people are losers. But the problem is, it's totally rooted in fantasy. You can't have a society where everybody lives the lifestyle of a billionaire, namely because one reason is because billionaires require people who work under them, right? That's what allows them to enjoy that lifestyle. They have basically servants, employees, whatever you want to call them, right? Who facilitate their comfort. Now, if that's the case, then the guy who's serving the billionaire can't also be a billionaire. Otherwise, you run into an infinite regress, right? So the billionaire lifestyle inherently implies a hierarchy. So it's incoherent. It's rooted in fantasy. You can't have it. So likewise, until liberals show us a society by which we mean a completely closed system. By society, I don't mean a village, nor do I mean a city, nor do I mean a country, because we're talking now about a interconnected global society. So if you could have a relatively isolated system, that would count. But the point is, now that we're globalized with technology, you're gonna have to show us a global system that can exist where better conditions are created for the lowest class of people than what Islam did for them. Okay? So the claim here is not that Islam's system of slavery is some kind of ideal, but that it's the best solution for handling an unpleasant reality of the human condition. Okay? That the fact of this world is that you're going to have hierarchy, and there's divine wisdom for that, why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us in a hierarchy rather than just straight away in heaven where everybody can just enjoy what they want. There's reasons for that, right? The tension. If there was no hierarchy, there would be no opportunity for the poor person to be patient or for the rich person to be generous. Okay? That there wouldn't be these opportunities. So there's a divine wisdom in that as well. But the point is that you have an unpleasant reality that we have to deal with. Islam has proposed the solution. It's not saying that, oh my God, look how great slavery is. Isn't this awesome that, people have to endure things that they don't like, have to endure suffering, even just outside of slavery in general. It's not like, oh, look how great suffering is. It's like, no, this is a necessary part of our purpose in creation, basically. Now, Ridwan also brought up the point that liberalism treats its lower class better because of the possibility of social mobility. Okay? So, in Islam, a slave's a slave. This is his conceptualization. A slave's a slave. Whereas in liberalism, at least you have the opportunity to work up the ladder. Okay, what's the problem with this? First of all, there are always a limited number of resources or positions of status in a society at any given time. Now, this can expand or contract. Let's say if there's an economic boom that can expand, it can contract. But the point is it's still limited. When it expands, it's still limited. It didn't become unlimited, okay? So because of that, what happens is when you have a pyramid structure, a hierarchy, okay? When people move up, what that means is they're stepping on the heads of other people. As people move up, other people move down. Somebody has to be doing the jobs that nobody else wants to do. So if you're not doing those jobs, somebody else is. So the fact that you can move up from your position doesn't solve, as an individual, doesn't solve the problem that as a social class, you're stuck with these classes, and they will be filled with their requisite number of people who are going to fill each class. The fact that you can swap and play a shell game where someone moves up and another person moves down doesn't change the fact that people are still going to be at the bottom. And the fact of the matter is, the majority of people are going to be stuck in whatever position, right, in the lower position, indefinitely. It's a zero-sum game. Somebody has to win, but that means somebody else is losing. The fact of the matter is, to move out of the lower classes, you require exceptional levels of, conscientiousness, basically hard work, which most people lack. Most people get distracted. Most people, are tempted, right? Temptation is real. They're tempted by TV and just coming home from a hard day's work and just enjoying themselves because they worked. They just don't have the energy. You require intelligence. You require, this. You require traits which, the fact of the matter is, 95% of people don't have. Okay, so you're essentially dangling a carrot, saying, okay, well, you could advance, but the majority of people, in fact, won't. So, at the end of the day, what benefit is that? It's beneficial to a minority of people, who have those capabilities to advance, but the majority of people aren't. Now, the other part of this is this, that so the main point here is that the possibility of social mobility for an individual does not equal the possibility of social mobility for an entire class. That's fallacious thinking. Now, okay, so I want to just to illustrate the point more. Just imagine somebody who's working 2 or 3 jobs, 80 hours a week, has kids, and is struggling just to make ends meet. You're telling me that guy seriously has an opportunity to move up in the social ladder? He doesn't. He's spent. He's exhausted. He's done. He doesn't have anything left to give to try and now put in some kind of side gig to move up the ladder even more. He's stuck in that position. And many people do find themselves in similar circumstances. Now, the next point is this, that social mobility is also possible within an Islamic society. Islamic society doesn't have a straight-up caste system. Even for the slave class, so first of all, outside of the slave class, it's possible for somebody to become wealthy or poor. And then within the slave class as well, there's social mobility in 2 ways. The first is this, that even outside of Islam, the social status of a slave historically was related to the social status of his master. So for instance, the slave of Julius Caesar was one of the most powerful men in the Roman Empire because he was the slave of Julius Caesar, the guy who was the most powerful guy in the Roman Empire. So he would literally be like governing a city. People would pay respect to him. They would listen to his commands, and he's a slave, right? Why? Because they follow the status of their master. And I even read a 19th century travelogue of a British explorer of Islamic society, of the Islamic world, where he recorded that, for example, the tribal chief had a slave who would come to like different areas, and people would pay tremendous amounts of respect to him, because by respecting him, they're respecting the tribal chief. They would even give him gifts. They would stand up when he stood up. And in fact, he was sometimes arrogant and disrespectful to people because he was arrogant about it. So it's not, people sometimes have an imagination which doesn't, it's basically a mythologized imagination of what life was like in other societies, which we haven't lived in. And, most people don't have accurate historical information as to what it was actually like. Now, so that's one way. The second way is this. As a slave, you can request a manumission to be freed from your master. You can request for him to create a contract whereby you can buy your freedom. And Ridwan seemed to be aware of this. That is a form of social mobility. Okay, it's the same thing as somebody who's flipping burgers, working hard, and then becoming the CEO. Okay, it's the same concept, right? You work off your contract, you buy your freedom, and in fact, Islam has an injunction that, first of all, masters should accept when a slave makes this request. Second of all, even without this request, it's highly recommended for masters to free slaves. Okay, and third of all, when you free a slave, you are supposed to help them financially until they can until they can stand on their own 2 feet. Okay, this is also an Islamic injunction for the release of slaves. It's not that you just leave them on the street and that's it. No, you should help them to stand on their own 2 feet. So social mobility does also exist in the Islamic system, and perhaps it's arguably even a more humane form of social mobility, because the masters are commanded to help their slaves, and it doesn't cut off the social bond between master and slave. It preserves that as a human relationship. Whereas in capitalist society, bridges are burned all the time. It's very atomistic and inhumane, and there's no relation as you're climbing the social hierarchy. Lastly, I would like to point out that Ridwan doesn't seem to be aware that many slaves in history were perfectly comfortable being slaves. They were not unhappy. Okay? This might seem absurd to us because our entire image of what a slave is some guy getting whipped and abused. But the fact of the matter is, for the majority of slaves in history, that wasn't their life. They would get married, they would have children, they would be living their life. Okay? And again, this is coming from a British travelogue in which the guy asked a slave, okay, why don't you request freedom, whatever. He's like, no, I like my life. Like, why am I going to do it? I have a good life. I have a house. I have a wife. Everything's good. In the same way that many people are comfortable with their office jobs in modern day society, right? You tell them, look, why don't you start your own business, whatever. He's like, look, dude, I don't really care to. Like, I have my job. Yeah, it's some aspects of it suck, but overall it's not bad. I get my paycheck. I'm happy. I have my family. Like, I put in my 9 to 5 and that's it. That's a perfectly acceptable answer, right? So it's the same. It's a similar situation that goes on here. Now, I think the last topic here I have is apostasy. Okay. And Daniel brought up the hypocrisy of liberal states in claiming there is freedom of speech, but in fact cracking down brutally on dissenters as soon as their power is threatened. Now, this is true, but Ridwan countered that while this may be the case, how can you compare a single ordinary person who's not like a political leader, they're not leading a political leader, simply expressing their disbelief to somebody who's threatening the entire social order? Okay. Now, Daniel did bring up some good points about how, in the absence of a Leviathan state, you have a bottom-up order. And so, if you didn't have the top-down order by the Leviathan state in the West, you wouldn't be able to have the kind of religious pluralism that's currently enjoyed. And so a bottom-up system has to rely on social cohesion, and open declarations of apostasy, threaten social cohesion. Okay. Now, first of all, just a sociological point, that while it's true that in principle an apostate can be killed in Islamic law, an open apostate, as a sociological fact, there were atheist scholars who held debate amongst people of knowledge and even wrote books basically advocating for or explaining their atheist views. Now, the reason why they were allowed this and they weren't immediately executed or something like that, even when Islam was the dominant religion, is because usually these people didn't really pose a threat to the social order and the establishment. And so, like liberalism, a more lax attitude was taken, in fact. Okay? But if you say, okay, but it was there in the laws, what I'd say is that probably, and I have to look this up, but probably if you look in the laws of liberal states, anybody who, is a dissenter, there's probably laws there that allow them to deal very strong-handedly with them as well. They just don't apply it as long as the person isn't a social threat. So this seems to be something that's across societies, is generally speaking, if somebody's not a social threat, if the ruling ideology or government or whatever is in a position of strength, they don't take as heavy-handed an approach. Okay? But there's still the moral question. Okay, there's still the moral question. And so while I understand that Daniel was trying to appeal to a non-Muslim audience, and so therefore making arguments based on reasons that they would accept, sometimes I feel like it's important to show the internal consistency or the internal logic of Islam to the non-Muslim. Okay? So I think that there's benefit to this in showing to the non-Muslim that it's still a rational system from at least within its own framework. Even if to somebody who doesn't accept its starting assumptions, they might think it's wrong. That's still a useful thing to do. Now, the way I would do this is to say this: look, While it's true that apostasy can cause social harm, the real reason of an open apostate is put to death is that they threaten the afterlife of those around them. So if an apostate manages to shake the faith of even a single person, okay, and lead them to hellfire, they have committed an indescribably evil act, okay? What I would compare it to is this. What I would ask a non-Muslim is this. Look, would you allow somebody to go around shooting a flamethrower in public and even direct it at people and shoot it at people? Or would you immediately say that person has to be stopped, right? And if necessary, even killed, because they're putting people on fire. It's going to cause arson and, you know, people, getting third-degree burns and maybe even dying of, if their clothes catch on fire and whatever, like they can die, right? It can kill people. So you have to stop this. What I'd say is this. Look, from an Islamic point of view, the open apostate is shooting the eternal flamethrower of hellfire at people's faces. So you have to stop them. It's a question of even the basic harm principle, right? What they're doing from Islam, if Islam is true, what they're doing is not at all innocent. It is in fact worse than murder. It is worse than murder. Because at least with murder, you're taking the person's life. But with apostasy, you're potentially taking people's souls, their eternal salvation. So, a non-Muslim might counter-argue that, okay, so then the crime should be that if somebody converts others to, their apostasy, that would be the crime that they should then be punished for. In other words, just declaring that you're apostate shouldn't be a capital punishment crime, but proselytizing should be the crime. But what I would say is that this doesn't make sense, because in the same way that many states would ban carrying guns as a preventative measure, they wouldn't just ban the person who commits or prosecute the person who commits murder with the gun. Many societies say, look, let's not have guns at all, because if you have guns, then murder is going to happen. So in the same way, you don't just wait for the apostate to, confuse people and lead them astray. You take preventative measures, harsh preventative measures that prevent them from even happening. If that makes sense. In other words, you don't wait for the mass shooting to ban guns. You ban guns so that the mass shooting doesn't happen. If that makes sense. Now, a non-Muslim might say, okay, well, that means Islam is so weak, it doesn't tolerate criticism, and it's a weak ideology because it has to rely on force to get its point across. Okay, that might be their viewpoint on that. But what I would say is this: look, we've just established that every system, when threatened, brutally cracks down on dissent, including liberalism. And we have many examples of this. Okay? So if it was just a question of the ruling ideology being threatened, it would only do it when there's threat. Okay? The reason why it doesn't allow even any kind of open apostasy, even if it isn't leading to a political movement, is because Islam cares about the salvation of souls. Right? It understands very well that this one guy is not a threat to the system. The point is, though, that if he steals a single soul, that's a problem. Okay? So I hope that makes sense. And then the second thing is this, that look, Islam has dealt with intellectual criticism since its inception. You have Christians who have argued against Islam. You have Jews that have argued against Islam. You have atheists who have argued against Islam. Islam has no problem addressing intellectual criticism. Okay? Islam is more harsh when it comes to mocking, because that is the opposite of intellectual criticism, and this is a whole different topic in terms of freedom of speech, which maybe I can explain in another video because this one's already gotten long enough. But the point is that mocking is not the same as intellectual debate. Intellectual debate, Islam can and has and continues to deal with, and I think the books of systematic theology in Islam, the books of philosophy, the books of mysticism are more than sufficient to show that Islam does have a rich intellectual tradition which does not shy away from controversial or difficult questions. Okay guys, that's all I have for you. My apologies if this video was particularly long, but there was a lot to cover in that debate, and inshallah it was of benefit of you guys. Hopefully you guys got some something out of it. I will be posting the written version of these main points that I've made here over the coming days. Aside from that, please like, comment, share, subscribe. It means a lot. It helps get the word out. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.